Bienvenue, bon après-midi.
Welcome, good afternoon. It's very hot. Thank you for your courage to be here today. Before we begin, as with every session, I ask you to join me in taking refuge together and seeking to cultivate bodhicitta.
O Sanji Chodan Tsoji Chonam La Chanchu Parado Dane Chamsu Che Dagi Jinso Jibe Sonam Che Rola Penchira Sanji Drupa Shu Sanji Chodan Tsoji Chonam La Chanchu Parado Dane Chamsu che dagi jinsu jibe sunam chi rola penchira sanje drupa shu sanje chodan soje chonam la chanchu pardo dane chamsu che dagi jinsu jibe sunam chi rola penchira sanje drupa shu semje tamje dewa dan devi jodan dembar churchi dungara dan dungara chi jodan trawara churchi dungara mebe dewa tamba dan mindrawara churchi Nirin chadan tan charve tanyom chenpo la nepa churchi semche tamche dewa devi jodan dembar churchi dongara tan dongara chi jodan chawar churchi dongara mebe dewa tamba tan mindrawar churchi Nirin chadan tan charve tanyum chenpo la nebar churche semche tamche dewa tan devi jodan dembar churche dongara tan dongara che jodan chawar churche dongara mebe dewa tamba tan mindrawar churche Nirin chadan tan charve Tanyom chenpo la nebar churchi Chomden de jambe yang lai chan tsai lo Kange lo dre dim nye zhender nye tara namda rab sarve Chi nye tungun chi che si che ni che tokara lebams Kanda sebe tsunrara mari muntama dungara che sirve Drozo kyun la puche tarse yen la chuchu yang ten song Rudare che ro nyumo nye lo le che cha ro dro tse che mari munse dungara nyuku chi nye chun tse ra chen Dune ta chen sa ju tar sun yun tena lu zo gyar se tu yu ku chu ra chu tang chu ni chen da lu mun seren jambe yang la du Zeden chu je chen rab u zir che da lu temo mun ba rab saran Ka tang ting ju shung lu tok ba ye lo zhu bo be nang wa tsar tu sur
Could you adjust the fan so that it turns so that everyone can appreciate it? Maybe you need to lower it a bit. Better like that, right? For me, it's fine. Okay. So this afternoon, I propose that we continue studying the points that we spoke about this morning, connected with suffering. We talked about this in its general sense, but we haven't discussed the origin of suffering much. So I thought perhaps we could reflect on this subject this afternoon and also leave a bit of time for discussion. When we speak about the origin of suffering, it's important to keep in mind that we're trying to avoid, on the one hand, two types of extreme views concerning the origin of the world. On the one hand, there are the views that we call eternalist views, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, views said to be annihilationist. In other words, views that affirm that effects are produced without causes, and though causes may come together, there is not necessarily an effect that follows. So there are two kinds of categories, two groups of opinions. These groups are presented here somewhat generally. We're not necessarily designating a specific doctrine. It's a category in which one could include a great variety of philosophical doctrines. In the first category, that we call the eternalist views, we could include all of the doctrines that are, for example, that affirm that the world exists because it was created by an other, which might be a divinity, God, or it might be the self, or it might be some kind of power. In other words, the variety of the world appears based on the power of a single entity or multiplicity of entities, depends on the doctrines, but in any case, that the world appears due to a reason, that we can find this reason that is an entity that substantially exists independently from the manifestation of the world, or is part of it. Theistic doctrines that you can find in India, for example, the Samkhya school, which is a dualistic doctrine that affirms that from two ultimate substances, Purusha and Prakriti, a person, people, individuals, and matter arise, though they are one in nature and multiple in manifestation. There are all kinds of doctrines that can all be categorized here. In other words, that say that there is something substantial that truly exists independently that produces the world, the universe. Then there's the other extreme, which says that there's no reason for the world's being. It's simply random or accidental. And the world has no cause. And likewise, effects can not be produced even when the causes are brought together. So this is what we call an annihilationist view. So what is the position of Buddhism? Buddhism adopts a view that rejects these two extremes. It is a view of the middle way, we call it. That is careful not to identify as causes things that cannot be causes, and also is careful not to deny causes and conditions concerning the emergence of experience. In general, we can say that Buddhism affirms causality, but causality understood as being conditioned arising, rather than being a kind of linear causality with a first step that then leads to all the rest. There is rather causality here that is co-production. In other words, the effect and the cause mutually depend on each other. Each one is the origin of the other without either one being the origin specifically of the other. Generally, we think of the cause being the origin of the effect, but not the effect being the origin of the cause. The cause precedes the effect, and the effect arises from the cause. This is linear causality, but in dependent arising, there is mutual dependence. Cause and effect mutually appear. The effect appears from the cause, and the cause appears based on the effect. They are codependent. This is what we call dependent arising. This is true for all outer phenomena, the world, the universe, all elements do not appear based on nothing, nor based on things that cannot be their causes. The criticism that is a refutation of the eternalist view of eternalist production, in other words, that there is one cause, a substantial thing that produces the world. We could simplify this refutation if we just try to understand that a substantial thing cannot be part of causality. In other words, if something exists substantially, if it is, in the full sense of the term, it cannot undergo any change. Something that is and that exists cannot be becoming. Whereas causality, the emergence of the world, is becoming. It is something that manifests. Whereas something that is, for example, an attribute that we associate with God, or that we associate with the self, or in the context of the Samkhya, for example, Prakriti and Purusha, this attribute of being, if something is, it always is the same as itself. It cannot change. If it changes, then it no longer is. It's different. If it can change and be something else, then it is not truly. It has become something else. It's something becoming. And so there it is. Also, for something that is, that truly exists, producing this implies a beginning, a middle, and an end, becoming, changing, And something that is does not change. It cannot, in this sense, produce. Also, in this sense, it cannot be part of the causal chain of effects of manifestation. This is a simple explanation to refute the eternalist view. On the other hand, the other extreme, we can see that all that manifests dependent on a causal field. We cannot see things emerging from nothing. If this were the case, then we would see things spontaneously appear without causes and conditions. This is something that we do not observe on the one hand, and on the other hand, saying that things appear or are born based on nothing is substantial in a way, is a kind of being in and of itself. So the refutation that we already discussed can also apply here. So it is important to see these limits and not fall into these views, the eternalistic or annihilationist, and understand that all that is manifest or present manifests based on dependent arising. Now, we ourselves have an experience of reality. We are conscious via our five senses. We perceive the world. We see colors, sounds, experience, taste, smells, touch. We are connected with experience. Also, presently, our consciousness experiences suffering, as we saw this morning. Our mind experiences feeling or sensation at every moment. This is a conditioned experience marked by suffering, or at the very least, suffering in its manifest form, or in its potential form, or as the condition of a potential for suffering to be manifest. This situation. So how did we arrive here? Why am I in this circumstance? We might also ask ourselves, in Buddhism, there is a question of enlightenment, beyond suffering. So why am I not beyond suffering? If it is, as it is expressed in Buddhism, beyond suffering is our reality. It is Buddha nature. It is the essential quality of primary consciousness. So then, why have we not actualized this? So to talk about the emergence of conditioned existence, our personal conditioned existence for each of us, then it is a question of what we call the 12 links of dependent arising. This concerns inner dependent arising. Conscious beings such as ourselves and our experience of the world and life. So we can see that from the get-go, it's a very pragmatic approach. Why is there a world? How did the planets appear? Why did conscious beings appear? These are questions that are secondary for someone who is looking to go beyond suffering. The 12 links of conditioned existence. There are 12 terms, 12 points, if I may, that are presented. I'll give you the list. You can write it down and then think about it, and then we'll discuss each of them. So the list appears linear, but it's not necessarily a linear progression. They are mutually dependent. The first is avidya in Sanskrit, ignorance. Samskara, Che, Sanskrit, in Tibetan. This is sometimes translated as karmic formations. In the study of the entry to the state of Apantita, it's currently translated as conditioning phenomena. The third one is Namshe, in Tibetan, Vijnana, in Sanskrit. Consciousness. But consciousness here in the sense of a dualistic consciousness. Consciousness in terms of the state of confusion. The fourth one is Mingsuk in Tibetan, Nama Upa in Sanskrit, which is literally name and physical form. Name and physical body, let's say. Often called name and form, name and matter. Nama Rupa in Sanskrit. The next one is Chiche in Tibetan. Ayatana in Sanskrit. Sources of perception in general. Source of perception. It is also sometimes translated as sense basis. Next, Rikpa in Tibetan, Sparsha in Sanskrit, often generally translated by the term, literally, contact. Seventh point is Vedana. feeling or sensation. The 8th, Sipa in Tibetan. Trishna in Sanskrit, craving, sorry. Lenpa Upadana is the 9th. Grasping. Appropriation also. You could even understand it in the sense of addiction. The 10th is Bhava. Becoming. Sipa in Tibetan. The 11th is birth. Chewa or Chati. The 12th, Jarawanama. Hachi in Tibetan. Aging and death. So, ignorance, conditioning phenomena or karmic formations, consciousness, name and form, sense spaces, contact, sensation or feeling, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, aging, and death. These are the 12 links or the 12 parts of conditioned arising, dependent arising. We often see them represented in an allegoric way around the Bhavana chakra, the wheel of becoming, held in the hands of Yama. Held in his claws. He's holding a mirror, and it reflects the wheel of becoming around the edge. There are 12 panels with a little drawing, an illustration that allegorically represents these 12 links. The beginning shows an old woman or an old man, blind, walking with a stick. And that's the allegory of ignorance. We can't see where we're going. We're trying the best we can to find our way. And then for conditioning phenomena, vase, consciousness, there's a monkey jumping from branch to branch, trying to grab fruit. Then there is a boat, ferry with 4 passengers. Then a house with 6 openings, doors and windows. Then there's a couple embracing. Then a man with an arrow through the eye. And then a man refreshing himself. Then a monkey running away with a fruit. Then a pregnant woman, or becoming, a woman giving birth, for birth. And then a man carrying a cadaver to the cemetery for aging and death. So these are the allegories that we often see on the Bhavana chakra this image that we often find near the doorway of temples. It's an expression we often find among the Mula Sarvastivadin tradition of the Vinaya, which is one of the oldest representations of these 12 links of dependent arising. At the beginning of our era, unfortunately, a lot of this original version has been worn down, worn away, but we can see that it is the Bhavana Chakra, and we can find this at Ajanta, where there are a series of caves with lovely illustrations. So that's a brief explanation of the 12 links of dependent arising. There are other lists. It can be explained with more parts and less parts. It can also be divided. These 12 parts can be divided into 3. In other words, what we call afflictions, kleshas, another part that we call karma, or acts, and then phala, fruits or results. So concerning these 12 parts, the first is afflictions, the second is karma, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh are fruit, phala, results, the 8th and the 9th are klesha, the 10th is karma, the 11th and 12th are results. These 12 parts can also be read or considered according to 3 existences. The first 2 that we have inherited. The first 2 concerning the past life, 3 through 10 are current life, and 11 and 12 concern the determination of our following life. To give a little more explanation, ignorance, what do we understand ignorance to be? The important point concerning these 12 links of conditioned co-production or dependent arising. We can read them in this order. And this also, we can also read them in backwards order. We can start with the perception of aging and death, which can lead us to see what is the origin of aging and death. There is only aging and death because it is conditioned by birth. Birth is what conditions aging and death. But what conditions birth? That is existence becoming action. What conditions action? Grasping or appropriation. We'll describe it more after. And grasping, appropriation is conditioned by craving. And why is there craving? This comes from feeling, sensation, which arises based on contact, which is dependent on sense basis, which is dependent on name and form, which is dependent on consciousness. Consciousness itself is dependent on karmic formations or conditioning phenomena, which is dependent on ignorance. So we go from the coarsest to the most subtle. that all of these things are mutually dependent. This is why we call it conditioned co-production. They are all mutually dependent on each other. So let's look a little bit more deeply at ignorance. This is perhaps the most important for us. What we can begin to get a glimpse of here is that existence and becoming, our present condition, is dependent on causes and conditions, and particularly our actions, our thoughts, our acts. These acts are incited by the afflictions. For example, desire, aversion, jealousy, pride, etc. These afflictions emerge or manifest on the basis of ignorance. Ignorance, in a very simple way, what is it? In the common teachings of Buddhism, it is self-grasping. Self-grasping is connected to ego, the imperative of self, me, everything that we undertake for the self to gratify the self, to ensure the self's survival. Everything is for self. I, me. This self has different levels. The idea of me, I, this notion is connected with belief in our own existence, and due to this belief, an attachment to cherishing ourself. When we talk about self-grasping, doesn't necessarily mean that you're more egotistical than anyone else. An altruistic person can also experience self-grasping. It's not about being egotistical or altruistic. It is simply the belief in me, myself, oneself, and then this cherishing the self. Why is this ignorance? We might ask ourselves this question. We're so convinced of the self. I have my ID card, everyone calls me by my name, everyone identifies me as I identify myself. I feel good, I make decisions, things happen to me. Of course, I think that I exist. I am the continuation of the person that I was before. This notion of I, me, also involves two very important points to remember. First, the idea of a unit, an individual. I am one and the same person. And secondly, permanence. I am the same person, even though my appearance may have changed between childhood and now, physically, mentally, intellectually. Many things may have happened, I may have changed, but I keep this idea that There's something essential of me, myself, that is the same. So this is a notion of permanence, that there is something eternal. And furthermore, sometimes when we talk about past lives and future lives in our everyday language, we think of this in terms of the self. The self is what is reborn. Often in the West, this is associated with the idea of soul, the most essential part of our being, that is one and permanent. However, in Buddhism, we say that having this impression, this idea, this conception, this belief, this in fact is the expression of ignorance. We can understand by this that this self, I, me, does not exist. In other words, this self that is one and permanent cannot be found. When in Buddhism we say that the self does not exist, of course we are talking about this self that is one and permanent that does not exist. This is the target, if I may. This notion of a self, a me, that is one and permanent, this gives rise to this cherishing. This is what leads me to act. This is the force that brings me to act, to protect this self, this me. This belief in something fundamental is what leads to action, based on cherishing this self. But this cherishing of the self bases itself on the idea of a self that is one and permanent. And when Buddhism says that this one and permanent self does not exist, it's not asking us to believe that it doesn't exist. If you don't believe this, you're not a good Buddhist. That's not at all the point here. Simply try to find it. Examine the person that you are. Try to put a finger on it. What is this self that is one and permanent? We can look at ourself, our person. What is it made up of? It's made up of a physical body and a mental aspect, the mind, psychology, consciousness. All of these aspects, we can look at them, examine them. So to start, are we one? We can see, even at the very beginning, we are body and mind. It's not one. Furthermore, the body is multiple. The mind is multiple. The mind is made up of 6 or even 8 consciousnesses. The 5 consciousnesses of the 5 senses that are distinct from each other, that operate simultaneously, along with the mental consciousness that can further be divided. And consciousness is also accompanied by various mental factors, such as the 5 omnipresent mental events. There is not a single unit. We are multiple. We're made up of, well, not multiple, but we're made up of a multiplicity of things. Can we find one thing that is this self, I, me, and that can be an irreducible entity? We cannot find a physical or mental element that cannot be broken down. We cannot find a substantial element that remains permanent, the same. And so we can see that this notion does not correspond to any reality. And what does not correspond to a reality? When we conceive of something that does not correspond to reality, that we cannot find, then this is the very definition of ignorance. And from this ignorance comes confusion. Falling into the belief, grasping at this misunderstanding, mistaken idea. We conceive of ourselves as I, me, and this is a mistaken idea which leads to confusion. This is an explanation that we find. We can also consider in terms of the nature of mind. I'll come back to this point on ignorance and the different ways to explain it. We won't have the time to explain all of that. So just to give you, I'll give you a few definitions for the following things, and then we'll come back to ignorance because it's important. So karmic formations or conditioning phenomena. Due to ignorance, there are actions, first mental actions, grasping self and others, the emergence of afflictions, and this conditions consciousness. Consciousness, in other words, consciousness that grasps appearances, consciousness in the sense of as it is ordinarily manifest for us when we interact with the world, that there is a subject that perceives something else. So this is the manifest aspect of duality. Here, in the 12 links of dependent arising, consciousness specifically designates consciousness at the moment of conception. In other words, due to past actions, you have developed consciousness that corresponds with a certain life form. Human, animal, divine. This consciousness is conditioned by ignorance, conditioning phenomena, and then conditioned by these conditioning phenomena, karmic formations, then comes consciousness. Consciousness here is in the moment that precedes conception. Conditioned by consciousness, then come name and form, physical body and name. This is the moment of conception. Name designates the entity, the mental aspect of an entity, of a life form. And then physical form designates the body. Name and form of a human being. Name and form of an animal. Consciousness conditions birth. Name and form designate the moment of conception. Consciousness is the consciousness that precedes conception. Perhaps you've heard about in Buddhism the antarabhava, the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. So this here we're talking about consciousness at this moment that precedes name and form. And name and form is when consciousness has associated itself with an embryo. Then the following phase conditioned by body and mind, body and mental aspect. The 6 sense bases appear. In other words, an embryo develops its system of perception that corresponds with the type of life form it is. If we're human, we have a specific system of perception, which is different from that of a butterfly or a crocodile or a deva or a being in a lower destiny such as the pretas or the hell realms. So once the sense bases come to mature, then comes birth, which corresponds with contact. A newborn for the first time will be in contact with, or in any case, maybe as soon as its senses are developed, it can begin to hear. We call this contact. Traditionally, this arrives at its full functioning once birth has occurred. This is contact. Contact simply means the sense faculties are in connection with their corresponding objects. In the Abhidharmas, for example, nama rupa, name and form, corresponds with the 5 aggregates. And you can see it in the allegory, the ferry with 4 passengers. The ferry is the body, and the 4 passengers are the 4 mental aggregates: consciousness, sensation or feeling, distinctions, and conditioning phenomena, including the mental factors, etc. Mental events. The sense sources are the 6, there are the 6 consciousnesses, and then there are the 6 sources of perception, and contact is when they are in contact with their corresponding objects. At this moment, perception, conditioned perception specific to a life form is effective. This gives rise to feeling or sensation that we spoke of briefly earlier, suffering, as it were. The 3 forms of sensation are suffering, what we perceive as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And of course, there is a reaction to this. All of this, name and form, the sense basis, contact, and sensations are effects. They are consequences. But then they give rise to karma or impulse. Impulse manifests first as craving. We experience pleasure in terms of our sensations, and our reaction to this, if you will, is that we appreciate it. We want it to last. And conditioned by this comes grasping or appropriation. Desire or rejection of things that are unpleasant. The affliction, or desire in this case, reinforces itself. We want pleasant things to continue. There's appreciation and then appropriation. We want things to continue that we like. We don't want them to stop. And then this reaction conditions our acts, which leads to becoming. The previous two were affliction. Then comes the 10th one, becoming, represented by a pregnant woman. Existence, becoming. This is the action that is designated by its consequence. In short, becoming is what naturally follows action. It's not the action itself, rather it is the consequence. Existence, becoming. When impulse is manifest and we act, this action in and of itself conditions our future, our becoming. And so this is why this name is given to action here. If there is becoming, this becoming is manifest in the following birth. And this birth, of course, is conditioned by change, and thus leads to aging and death. This life form exhausts itself when the conditions that brought it to appear are exhausted. Of course, generally, new actions were produced. We can see from 3 to 10 there are vidya and samskara that are present. Also, birth, aging, and death that appear later. So this is a way of presenting not only the origin, the way that this lifetime manifests, but also how future lifetimes manifest. And in particular, we can then see the essential point, the weakness of this causal chain reaction. There are certain things that there's nothing we can really do anything about them. Things that are fruit, that are effects. We cannot change our birth. We cannot change the fact that we will get old and die. We cannot change the physical and mental dispositions that we presently have, but there are certain elements that we can act on. Notably, the afflictions and the actions. The weak links of this chain, if I may, are here explicitly. Existence, becoming, will cease when craving and grasping are dissipated. And craving and grasping can only be dissipated if ignorance is eliminated. This gives you a general idea. We'll come back specifically to the point on ignorance. Perhaps you have some questions. Rinpoche, I would like to know if a daily Vajrasattva practice directly acts on ignorance by eliminating the seeds contained. Rinpoche says, it's a very good question. It is said that Vajrasattva practice can eliminate billions and billions of years of negative karma. A single recitation of Vajrasattva's mantra. But when we think about the negative predispositions in the stream of our being from beginningless time, then we need to recite a lot of Vajrasattva. So Vajrasattva practice is very useful in that it allows for dissipating our negative karma. But more importantly than Vajrasattva practice is realizing emptiness, the ultimate nature of mind. Because if we realize this, then we can access, we are able to go beyond all karma. We are free from the conditioning of karma. So long as conditioning is present, even if we practice Vajrasattva, a single instant of anger can also destroy billions of years of patience and effort. For example, we may practice Vajrasattva for hours and hours. We stand up, somebody makes us angry, we say something harsh, and all of our practice can be destroyed. Perhaps not just this practice, but even the practice that we have accomplished over numerous lifetimes before. This is such as the strength of anger, for example. There was a disciple who said to a master, it's a story, when you speak about the benefits of practice, you, of course, you'll become liberated, but I think even I could become liberated. But then when you speak about the flaws, then I think, well, I certainly have no chance. But then I think maybe even you, Master, you have no chance. You won't succeed. So long as we are in confusion, the functioning of karma continues. And we are not free from becoming. Of course, virtues can help, can improve our conditions, but negative forces can also create unfavorable conditions very easily. We are constantly held in the fangs of the Lord of Death. We are on the edge of a precipice. We can fall at any moment, like a blind person walking along the edge of a cliff. Due to the power of an affliction, we can fall into the infinite abyss of the lower destinies. So we're in a situation that is, at the very least, somewhat delicate, rather precarious. So long as we do not have access to wisdom, so long as we don't cultivate this, one who understands wisdom, who cultivates it, then all of the qualities come together. Then no afflictions can manifest any longer. So Vajrasattva is very, very good. But even better, realizing emptiness. That was very clear. I have the text. It's flawless. I wanted to ask you, is seeing an element, a complement, continuously empty, does that allow us to see everything? Or is there a progression? Well, I think if we have truly understood what we mean by emptiness, the objective of understanding emptiness is that reification exhausts itself. Ordinarily, we're constantly reifying. For example, in the Madhyamaka approach, we consider our conceptions, our preconceptions that are expressed through various philosophical doctrines. We examine them very precisely, and this examination allows us to see that reification that is implicitly affirmed, it cannot be affirmed. In fact, we refute all reifications, all substances, all things that exist in and of themselves. Self, other, one, multiplicity, an origin, a non-origin, and all of these reifications exhaust themselves. And if we manage to understand the absence of existence in terms of one thing, then we can apply this same analysis to other things, all thoughts, all concepts, and all of the reification that we apply exhausts itself. And with this exhaustion, it is not nothingness that is affirmed. In this sense, false attribution and denial are both surpassed. So then a question that's troubling me somewhat. Does the Buddha have an essence? Rinpoche replies, no, he doesn't have an essence. That's the source of this old statement, if you see the Buddha, kill him. That's what some Zen masters used to say. In other words, if you see the Buddha, then you haven't seen the Buddha. You're just reifying. Sentient beings cannot find an essence, but not being able to find an essence is also not reifying a non-essence that would be a kind of essence. We could say it another way. Simply, we are seeing the limits of thought. When we think that we know. But thought is a way of functioning. Of course, we need to use it, but it involves certain obscuration. When we think, we reify, we grasp. So all of this refutation is that this reification, this grasping, is mistaken and it can be eliminated. And then there is knowledge, but this knowledge no longer has this false attribution, this aspect that is obscurating, that is connected to what we might call cognitive bias or cognitive obscuration. Hello, Rinpoche. On the basis of your answer to the question on Vajrasattva, then we become aware of the precariousness of our situation. Then rebirth becomes somewhat anxiety-inducing. I mean, we're laughing because we're together, but we're all alone. And we think about it, I mean, at least for myself, how much power do I have over my rebirth? Do you have any advice for people like us who are new, who recently encountered the Dharma, who only have so much time ahead of us, so that we may have a better chance of encountering the teachings again in the following life? I think a first point is understanding the misdeeds that are afflictions, how these are poisons. Often, in the name of practice, we have fear for ourselves. We develop a lot of pride. In fact, we don't manage to go beyond or escape from the poison. It's important in daily life to see how these poisons are present in us, how they can destroy us, to have a certain awareness concerning their presence and understand how to remedy these afflictions, and also see the positive qualities that we have within ourselves. We have the capacity for kindness, compassion, and it's important to also develop confidence in this, to rely on this, and to develop aspiration. Nothing depends on something external. If we develop aspiration and we develop our own qualities based on practice, as it is explained, as we carry it out, then our aspirations can come to be. If we engage in what we call wishing prayers, that's how we translate the term, munlam in Tibetan. Through practice, we cultivate our own qualities, we cultivate knowledge, for example, by studying the Dharma now. And in these moments, we create positive karma. And with our wishes, we orient this positive karma so that this positive karma brings about such and such wishes. If wishes are not nurtured by karma, then they don't bring anything about. And if we don't have clear wishes, then our positive karma doesn't go in any useful direction. If we have wishes like, oh, I'd like to be powerful, I'd like to be wealthy, then our positive karma can go in that direction, and in the end it won't be helpful, it will be harmful. So it's important to make these wishes associated with wishes that go in the direction of practice. May I never be separated from the Dharma, from lifetime to lifetime. May I be beneficial for sentient beings. If we have these kinds of ideas and wishes, this type of aspiration that is supported by our virtuous practice, then these aspirations will be realized, and we can have confidence in this. I think it's very hot. Perhaps we'll conclude here for today. I'll see you tomorrow, hopefully under more clement conditions. It's supposed to be a bit less hot, so I'll see you all tomorrow at 10.
Ye tamche seba nye tone nye be ranam pamche ne chega na che balap truba sibe tsolen ro wa sho.